All right, we'll get going. So welcome, everyone. Welcome to Finding a Clinical Trial That's Right for You with Dr. Elly Cohen. My name is Christine Benjamin, and I'm the Breast Cancer Program Director at SHARE. So before the presentation begins, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about SHARE. SHARE is a 40-year-old nonprofit organization that helps people through breast or ovarian cancer, offering the support of those who've been there. SHARE offers many services, including helplines, telephone and in-person support groups, and educational programs. All services are free of charge to participants. For more information, visit our website at www.sharecancersupport.org. All participants will be muted during the presentation. You're welcome to submit questions throughout the presentation. When Dr. Cohen finishes speaking, we'll open up for questions and answers. Questions that have been submitted will be read to Dr. Cohen. Anyone participating by webinar can submit questions through the question pane in the control panel on your screen. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Elly Cohen. Dr. Cohen is a University of California at San Francisco Assistant Professor of Surgery and Program Director of BreastCancerTrials.org, a clinical trial matching service dedicated to helping patients find clinical trials personalized to their situation. She has led BCT through its development, pilot evaluation, and successful launch as a nationwide nonprofit service in 2008. Breast Cancer Trials currently lists over 600 studies and attracts over 100,000 visitors per year. As an extension of Breast Cancer Trials, Dr. Cohen and her team recently launched Metastatic Trial Search, a matching tool designed for patients with metastatic breast cancer in collaboration with 5 breast cancer advocacy organizations. Dr. Cohen is frequently invited to talk about clinical trials to patient groups and is actively involved in the Metastatic Breast Cancer Alliance. She has a BA in biology from Brooklyn College and a PhD in pathology from Cornell University. She's also a breast cancer survivor. So welcome, Elly. Thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome, Christine. I'm delighted to be here. And just for total transparency, I am not a surgeon. It's just a quirk of how UCSF allocates people to departments that I'm an assistant professor of surgery. So I'm happy, as I said, I'm delighted to be here. And just for some context, in addition to talking to you about how to find a trial, I want to provide a broader perspective of current trends in clinical trials and some of the barriers that prevent patients from participating in trials in the hopes that together we can overcome those. But to start, some reason okay. I want to sort of get you all warmed up for listening and engage you a little bit in how to think about clinical trials and really to make sure we all understand how important they are by learning about and really viscerally feeling how far research has come in the last, in this case, we're going to be talking about over 200 years. So I'm going to ask some, 3 questions now to sort of test your clinical trial IQ, but this is not a test. This is more of a fun exercise. And Christine is going to help me make this a little bit more interactive. So my first question to you is in 1747, and really please focus on 1747, Dr. James Lind, who was from Britain, conducted the first clinical trial ever recorded in history that was published in a medical journal. And what was he studying? Was it leeches? Was it the foxglove plant? And foxglove contains the active ingredient for digitalis, a very common medicine used for cardiac disease. Was it the willow tree bark? And the willow tree bark has the same active compound that it's used in aspirin. Or was it lemons? So take a couple of minutes, and Christine will call upon 1 or 2 people to get their perspective on this.
So if you think you know the answer, you can raise your hand. You could do that on your control panel. There should be a little hand. You can raise it and I can unmute you and you can share your answer with us.
I'd like to also find why you chose that particular answer.
So no hands so far. Anyone?
Come on, isn't there somebody brave who wants to take a guess? No, Christine, nobody?
Oh, wait, here we go.
Okay.
This is Alyssa. I'm going to unmute you. Alyssa, you're unmuted. Oh, I think. Alyssa, can you hear us? I'm not sure.
Okay, Christine, you want to take a guess? And then we'll...
Let's see. Let me ask the audience one more time. You can write the answer in the question pane. Alyssa, for some reason, we're not able to hear you. Okay, she wrote. She said the answer is lemons.
Okay. All right, Alyssa, you know your history, and that is absolutely right. If it was me, I would have guessed leeches, because that was one of the most common ways of treating a variety of medical illnesses in the 18th century. In fact, George Washington was treated with leeches. He died of throat cancer. I think it was throat cancer, and was treated with leeches. It was very painful. But lemons it is. And the reason it was lemons is that in the 18th century, Britain ruled the sea, but the most common cause of death among British sailors was a disease called scurvy. And nobody knew what caused scurvy or how to prevent it, but Dr. James Lind, who was on a boat as a scientist, observed that the sailors that were eating citrus fruits, limes and lemons at the time, seemed to be immune from scurvy. So he actually set up a clinical study or research study where he divided the sailors in different groups and gave them different foods. And it turned out that the sailors who had oranges and lemons did dramatically better than the other treatments. And that became a very, very important addition to the diet of British sailors. Okay, so our next question is, and it's not a question, it's more to sort of pique your understanding and appreciation for research, is Abigail Nabby was the eldest daughter of President John Adams. And you may not have known it, but she died of breast cancer in 1813 at the age of 46. And which of the following are true? She used folk remedies before consulting a Harvard doctor. Now, remember, her parents lived in Boston. They were a prominent family, and Harvard even then was the most famous of medical institutions. She had a mastectomy without anesthesia, and her doctor did not sterilize his instruments. I'm going to argue that all of the above is true, because it's really, I always find it very scary to see what people went through in this case, the early 19th century. To give you some perspective, we all talk about cells, and now we're talking about molecular biology within cells. But in 1813, scientists didn't even know about the cell. They didn't know what the building block of tissues were. In terms of anesthesia did not come into existence till 1846. And yes, Nabby was terrified of having any kind of surgery because she knew she would not get anesthesia and it would be a very brutal surgery. And so she did try folk medicines until the tumor in her breast had become very, very large. And she was operated on in her parents' home and without, as I said, anesthesia and without sterile technique. And it's amazing she survived the surgery, but she did die 7 years later from her disease. So again, just think about how far we've come. And the last question I want to pose to you is right now we know that clinical trials are incredibly important in advancing breast cancer care. When was the first clinical trial completed that actually changed breast cancer care? Was it 1798, 1888, 1948, or 1971?
And again, you can raise your hand, and I can try to unmute you, or you can type your answer into the question pane.
Anybody want to take a guess? Okay.
Couple of guesses. There are a couple of guesses here. Yes. 1948. Someone else guessed 1971.
Okay. So if I was guessing, I would have guessed 1948. And the reason is chemotherapy as we know it today was not in existence until after World War II. And at that, it took several years until the use of chemotherapy and hormone therapy actually became integrated into breast cancer care. It wasn't until 1970 that tamoxifen was shown to be an effective agent for use in breast cancer care. So before that, almost all of breast cancer care was surgical or done, there was some radiology, radiation oncology as well. So the first clinical trial that actually changed care was in 1971. And this was because there was a very, very vigorous debate among surgeons about how to best care surgically for breast cancer patients. Before 1977, the standard of care for breast cancer was a radical mastectomy. And we don't even talk about that. I'm not even sure how many of you even know what a radical mastectomy is, but a radical mastectomy removes not only the tissue, your breast, the lump, your hard breast, but also takes a lot of surrounding tissue. And it was based on the theory that all breast cancer is the same. And if you can get the breast cancer out surgically, then you will prevent it from spreading. And between 1894, when William Halsted devised this surgery, and 1977, there was a group of surgeons that became more and more aggressive about how much tissue it took out and paid little attention to the psychological effects on women or the fact that it was disfiguring women. But somewhere, and I don't know exactly where, so let's just say around 1960, other investigators began to realize that even though people were having radical mastectomies, no matter how radical it was, there was still a group of women who were developing metastatic disease. And they came to appreciate the fact that not all breast cancer was the same, that there were breast cancers were inherently different in terms of what their aggressiveness is. And they advocated to have a clinical trial to show that if you had a very small tumor, if you compared people that had these radical procedures with those which initially just had a simple mastectomy, removing the breast, and then a few years later just removing the lump and combining radiation, to determine what the outcomes were. And the surgeons who advocated for radical mastectomy were vehemently opposed to this, and it took, I would say maybe 10 or 15 years to get this trial launched. And they finally did it, and it was due to this individual, Bernard Fisher, who was a surgeon and also a very respected researcher, pushed it through, and by George, what we know now is either a simple mastectomy or a lumpectomy and radiation is just as effective as a radical mastectomy for certain types of early stage breast cancer. And this is an incredible advance in breast cancer care. So without further ado, let's just move on to the rest of the webinar. And clinical trials is simple to say. It's how well medical approaches work in people. And the people is really emphasized here because we know a lot about how investigative agents work in laboratory mice and rats. And if we were exactly like laboratory mice and rats, perhaps breast cancer would already have a curative component. But unfortunately, humans are very, very different. So it's imperative that even though something has been extensively studied, a new treatment, that it be tested in people. But yet there's a lack of studied volunteers, and this continues to hobble the cancer fight. Breast cancer, any kind of clinical trial, is really a partnership between research investigators and patients who volunteer to participate in those trials. And we can't advance breast cancer care without fulfilling that partnership. So why should you care about it? What's in it for each of you? And the question you might ask is, what's in it for me? And one of the most important factors, and we'll be talking about this over and over again, it's access to new medical knowledge, tomorrow's drug today. And I would advocate and just ask you always that if you are considering a treatment for your breast cancer, no matter where you are on your cancer journey, that you always consider clinical trials as an option for care. The decision to participate is totally up to you, but it's really important that you know all your options, and we'll go into this later in the webinar. Now, there are certain patients for which standard of care is no longer working, and what I mean by standard of care, the drugs that have already been approved by the Federal Drug Administration and are used routinely in the clinic. At a certain point, for patients with metastatic breast cancer, their options become limited. But clinical trials provide them with options in addition to standard of care. Really important to keep that perspective. I think the question we also have to be asking as a community is what's in it for us, because we are a community. And when we look at the question that way, every time you participate in a clinical trial or any other type of medical research, you're contributing to scientific knowledge and accelerating research. And you're helping future patients, even if you're not receiving a personal benefit yourself. And I'm sort of the poster child of that. Christine mentioned, I think in the bio, that I am a breast cancer survivor. I was diagnosed with early stage breast cancer in 1999. I had a mastectomy because my cancer had actually been in multiple places in my breast, so I wasn't eligible for a lumpectomy. Because of the size of my tumor, I had chemotherapy. I also had 10 years of hormone therapy. But in addition to being a survivor, I'm also the daughter of a mother who had breast cancer and sadly died of breast cancer 4 years after her diagnosis. She was diagnosed in 1975. She had a simple mastectomy, so she benefited from the clinical trials, compare a radical mastectomy and simple mastectomy, so she didn't have to have that disfiguring surgery. But there was no what we call adjuvant therapy at the time to prevent a recurrence, and the chemotherapy that I had and the hormone therapy is in that category of adjuvant therapy. So she had no adjuvant chemotherapy. She had no adjuvant hormone therapy. They didn't even know how to test for hormone responsive therapy, or at least wasn't standard of care in 1975. And sadly, she died of metastatic disease 4 years later. So I feel like I benefited from all the patients who had participated in clinical trials between the time of my mother's death in 1979 and my own diagnosis 20 years later. So I think it's sort of pretty clear that clinical trials are important. It's important for each of you. It's important for us as a community. So why aren't more people participating? And there are a variety of myths that no matter how many times organizations talk about myths versus facts, these myths are still very prevalent in the community. And some physicians actually hold these myths as well. And even though many of you who attracted this seminar have probably understand these myths, it's important for us to really talk to other patients about it. And one of the most prevalent myths is that clinical trials should only be considered as a last resort. And in this case, they're addressing that as for patients with metastatic disease. And as I said before, it does provide options if you've run out of options, but there are trials that are available for patients with metastatic breast cancer at any time in their experience with the disease. And very often physicians will say to a patient, well, let's just try standard of care first. And if you don't do well, let's say on first-line standard of care, then we'll think about a clinical trial. But we're in a new age now. We're in an age of precision medicine, and we're looking at targeted therapies. And there are a variety of targeted therapies now that are in trial. And targeted therapies, I mean drugs that are looking specifically at a specific type of tumor, not sort of generalized chemotherapy, that have less side effects and potentially more effective. And if you don't consider trials at that time for a targeted therapy as an option for care, then if you fail on standard therapy, you may not be eligible for that trial because you've already experienced or had treatment that would make you ineligible. So I think at every stage of disease, particularly for metastatic patients, you should always think about what clinical trials are available for you during that period of where you are in your disease, and you may still elect to go for standard therapy, but do that as an informed patient. But in addition to metastatic disease, there are trials that are across the breast cancer spectrum. Patient prevention trials for patients who are healthy or at high risk, trials for patients with early or newly diagnosed breast cancer, and trials for post-treatment survivors. And there's a lot of post-treatment survivors, including myself, out there. How do we keep ourselves healthy? What kinds of things are available to prevent recurrences? And we'll talk about different types of trials in a minute. Second myth, clinical trials are only for treatment. And yes, those are very, very important that we understand what kinds of treatment trials are available and when they're available for us. But breast cancer is a very complicated disease, and we all experiencing it very, very differently. And not only that, some of the treatments we have side effects, such as chemotherapy drugs have a certain of them have well-known side effect of neuropathy, where there's tingling in your hands and feet, sometimes being very severe, making it difficult to even walk or button clothing. There are clinical trials looking at symptom management, so we have a number of trials looking at ways to alleviate the symptoms or even prevent neuropathy. There are other types of issues related to breast cancer just in terms of our quality of life. How do you cope with the disease when you're experiencing not only symptoms, but just knowing that you have breast cancer? And so there are many trials looking at various complementary and alternative programs. And again, we'll look at some of these again later. But for example, mind-body programs for metastatic breast cancer, does that improve the quality of life? And again, when we're talking about clinical trials, we're looking at some type of intervention that's happening, whether it's a drug, whether it's participating in a focus group, or a group of patients who are undergoing or having this mind-body program, and then comparing them to another program or a patient population that isn't, so that you can sort of try and tease apart whether these things that sound good, are they really helping patients? Another area that has become a focus of research is chemotherapy hair loss. And I know that for me, when I had chemotherapy, I felt fine, but the thought of losing my hair was very, very devastating until I actually went through it, and then it wasn't quite as devastating as I thought it would be. But it is nice to have your hair when you're going through chemotherapy. And there are suddenly a number of devices that are out there that mostly involve what's called scalp cooling to determine if these are effective in terms of preventing hair loss and what is the impact on a patient's quality of life. So there are trials around those. There are also, as I said, trials for prevention and screening. There are other types of medical research besides clinical trials. And I said before, clinical trials really relate to some kind of intervention. Something is happening to one group of patients. It's not happening to a second group, and the investigator is comparing the impact. A very important, I just want to go back one place and just mention one thing that was a very important clinical trial that results were publicized about 3 years ago, really changed the quality of life of breast cancer patients. And that was a trial that looked in a very, very large number of patients at the effect of weightlifting on potential lymphedema. For those of us who had surgery where lymph nodes were removed, there's always the fear that your fragile lymph system will be disturbed even more and you will have swelling in your arms that once it happens, you can no longer treat it. And it's extremely uncomfortable and could be painful. And I remember I was told you can't lift weights, you can't even wheel luggage on the hand that was affected, always do it on your other hand. Well, one researcher said, wait a minute, is this really true? And went through a series of research proposals looking at lifting weights and to see if it actually did impact lymphedema. And lo and behold, lifting weights in a managed weightlifting program actually alleviated the symptoms of lymphedema, and in some cases actually there was evidence that it prevented it. So again, a way that clinical trials that are not treatment can really impact the quality of life of breast cancer patients. But in terms of other medical research that's not clinical trials, there are epidemiological studies looking at a specific group of patients, and often these studies collect information either through surveys, and it can be by phone interviews, it could be paper interviews that are mailed in, or now online interviews. And again, these are really important because you're collecting information from a large group of patients, and you can look at how various attributes of those patients' life may have impacted your care. One of the studies, which I think is ongoing, is called the Sister Study, where they're looking at a sister who's had breast cancer and a sister who hadn't, to look at the potential environmental impact of breast cancer. Other studies are now really adding a genetic component to the epidemiological study because we're knowing a lot more about the differences between the biological makeups of tumors. So in addition to completing a survey, they're asking patients to mail in a saliva sample, which gives the researchers some indication of the patient's genetic makeup, again, to make some correlation between other aspects of the patient's life and their genetic makeup and how that may lead to breast cancer, either the development of breast cancer or how they've experienced breast cancer or how they've responded to treatment. But again, these studies still are looking at a very well-described patient population. There's now other groups of studies where almost all patients can participate, and I really urge all of you to look at them. I'm going to mention 3 that are being done by very, very well-respected nonprofit organizations. The first one is the Cancer Experience Registry, and that's conducted by the Cancer Support Community, which is a nationwide nonprofit organization providing care and support to patients, similar to SHARE, but they do it through different mechanisms, but they have a research arm. And their research arm is collecting information from patients, looking at that information to draw hypotheses and test those hypotheses in research studies. The Cancer Experience Registry is involved with coping, and they collect information from any cancer patient from the minute that they first were diagnosed with cancer throughout their journey to look at different coping mechanisms, draw hypotheses, and then develop research studies to further benefit other patients. And they used to have a breast cancer registry, and I think when you join, you indicate what your cancer is, and then they look at individuals as related to their specific cancer. Another one is a registry that is developed by the Susan Love Research Foundation. They also have the Army of Women. This is different. This is, again, collecting information from all women, healthy women, women who've had breast cancer, to understand more about the experiences, what's different about women who develop breast cancer than those who have not had breast cancer. Can they draw hypotheses and develop research programs about preventing breast cancer? And the last one is one that's relatively new. The other two are around for a while. And this is the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project. And it's open to all patients with metastatic breast cancer. And this is being conducted at the Broad Institute in collaboration with Dana-Farber at Harvard. And they are asking breast cancer patients to create a profile of their experience with metastatic breast cancer, but they're also asking them to give them permission to access any information about their tumor specimen that may have been donated, the patient has donated at the place that they're being treated. And one thing that's very interesting about this study is that they're looking at, in addition to other things, what they call exceptional responders. And this is a new area of research that has emerged as we understand more and more about the molecular profiles of tumors. When you generally do a clinical trial, you look at the statistical results of how patients who had the experimental drug compared to patients that didn't. And you look for a statistical mean, and to make sure that that statistical mean, meaning the average patient did better in the experimental group than the patient in the control group. So you're looking at patients, the average patient in both groups. With exceptional responders, you're looking at patients that did much better than that average patient. And the question is, why did they do much better? What can we learn from their experience, their biology? What other factors that contribute to their life? And so the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project, among other things, is going to be looking at exceptional responders. There are other groups that, in addition to exceptional responders, are also looking at what we call rapid progressors. Again, the other end of the spectrum, people who have taken that same either standard of care or experimental therapy and did not do so well. What is different about those populations at the extreme that can be instructive? So I urge you all to look at these registries. It really doesn't take very much time. And again, as a community, we're participating. So the last myth that I want to look at is this myth about treatment trials not being safe. And we hear over and over again, people are afraid of being guinea pigs. And there's two aspects that I want to relate to this. One is from the scientific perspective. Before a trial is even approached or looked at, will be open for people, it goes through extensive preclinical testing. Testing in the lab, to get a sense of how these drugs are metabolized in the body, testing in animals to try and get a sense of what would be, is this drug effective? Does it shrink tumors in laboratory mice or laboratory rats? What is the dose that it's effective in these animals? And it's only when there's a real sense that this is potentially safe and effective for humans that we start testing these drugs in what we call a phase 1 trial. And the purpose of the phase 1 trial is really to find out what is the most effective dose in humans, and they generally start at a dose that's about a tenth of what they would have predicted from animals, and they gradually ramp up the dose, and it's done in a very small number of people, and what the focus is on the drug safety. I will say now with targeted therapy, researchers are actually encouraging patients with metastatic disease at various times in their journey to think about phase 1 trials, because with targeted therapy, you could also start looking at effectiveness. And generally, if you're on a phase 1 trial and it is effective, you continue, that drug is made available to you. The next phase is phase 2 trials. And here's where we're looking at that same study, which now we understand what the most effective dose is. In other words, the highest dose you can give without causing any kind of side effects. And the drug has some signal that it's effective. And it's only with those two parameters are met that you continue into phase 2. It's a slightly larger group of people. Phase 2 trials involve maybe 50 to 300 people. And again, they continue to monitor safety. That's a really important part across all of clinical trials, looking at any kind of adverse events. Certainly serious adverse events would put the end to the trial. But they're also looking at things like nausea and rashes, other types of diarrhea, things that could be managed with other types of compounds. So how to manage those symptoms. And again, most importantly, in phase 2, you're beginning to evaluate effectiveness. Are patients showing a benefit? Once phase 2 is established, we move into phase 3. And here's where the rubber meets the road. Phase 3 will can enroll hundreds of thousands of patients across the country. And it's not only to continue to monitor safety and effectiveness, but to compare whether or not that compound, that investigative agent, compare what's currently involved in drugs that are out there. Is it safer? Is it better? And it's what's called placebo-controlled, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's only after a study finishes its phase 3 trial, and at least successfully in at least 2 phase 3 trials, that the FDA will approve it to be marketed. And to be marketed, that means to make available to all patients in the clinic. Now, before I go on and talk a little bit about phase 3, I just want to mention one other thing about safety. One is that if there's a new investigational drug, between the preclinical testing and phase 1, the FDA has to approve its use in women by really closely monitoring the preclinical data. The second thing is, before a trial can open up at any site, that site has a responsibility to make sure that the safety of patients who participate in that trial is safeguarded. And there is a group at every single site that monitors safety. It's called an institutional review board. And the institutional review board will review the protocol to make sure that the protocol adheres to what that institution safety standards are. It also makes sure that patients have a process for learning about what are the potential risks and benefits to that patient for participating in trials, and that the patient is presented with that information in a patient-friendly way, and that's what's called informed consent. And lastly, as part of informed consent, and it's really important for patients to understand that when you participate in a trial, that you are free to withdraw from participating in that trial at any time for whatever reason, and that your care at that institution can't be jeopardized at all. If you want to revert back to standard of care, then your doctor, without question, has to do that without at all any kind of retribution. So I just want to very quickly go into the phase 3 trial, because there's an important myth that's associated with that. And one, you also very often hear that clinical trials, especially in phase 3, are placebo-controlled. And patients think that means that if I'm randomly assigned to that experimental group, I'm going to get no treatment. And that's not true. So you generally have an experimental group and a control group in a phase 3 trial. In a phase 3 trial, the experimental group gets an experimental treatment. And both groups, let me back up, I missed something. Both groups, this is standard of care. Whether you're in the experimental group or the control group, both groups get the standard of care. The experimental group, on top of that, gets the experimental treatment. The control group gets a placebo instead of the experimental treatment. So every group gets the standard of care, and that's a really important misconception. And I think investigators, bear the blame, because you always see in these long scientific titles placebo-controlled. But placebo-controlled means that the control group is getting only standard of care. So the last thing, and I see my time, I want to rush through because I want to give you some demos about how to find a trial. But one thing that's very important, we are now in the age of precision medicine. We're looking at therapies that are targeted to tumors' molecular status, and we need different kinds of trials to meet this new challenge. And so we have a group of trials called basket trials. You may have referred to them as bucket trials. And these trials are enrolling patients across cancer types based upon what genomic mutations or alterations their tumor has rather than where their tumor started. So NCI Match, which recently opened again for enrollment, is a great example of a basket trial. It's enrolling patients, it expects to screen 5,000 patients across many types of solid tumor trials, including breast cancer. What's different about these trials is there's 3 steps to a basket trial. First trial is your eligibility. First is just to be part of the screening population. So the eligibility criteria to enroll in a basket trial is very, very minimal. And the reason for that is, again, we're looking at mutations. So they're trying to cast a very, very wide net of patients, and patients who then are in the screening phase will have their tumors biopsied. So you have to agree to have your tumor biopsied, and it will be screened for genetic mutations. And then only patients that have that genetic mutation, so a relatively, at this time, small population of those patients, maybe 10% of the patients that are screened, will actually be enrolled in the treatment arms. And they expect to have 24 treatment arms looking at different targeted therapies, and people who are in those treatment arms are going to be patients that are across cancer. So you're not going to be segregated by your cancer type. So these are very interesting trials. This is the new age of precision medicine, and I urge you to look into these kinds of trials. So one thing, we just want to move forward, and why aren't patients participating in trials? Now, I am leader of an organization called breastcancertrials.org, and it was really founded by 2 patients who wanted to participate in trials, but their physicians really did not give them the opportunity. The physicians did not tell them on trials. So they came up with an idea, can we create a personalized matching service? And they took their idea to UCSF, and this was in 1999. I was a project manager at the time. A little demo was created in around 2000, and then the National Cancer Institute became interested in what we were doing and helped us launch a research pilot, which went from 2003 to 2005. And what we determined from the research pilot is, yes, this is something that patients were interested in participating in. We could match patients to trials. We could do it effectively. And based upon that, we launched as a nonprofit service in 2008. And right now, last year, we had 120,000 visitors to the site. So there are 2 ways that you can use breastcancertrials.org, and I'm going to try and move through this in about 5 minutes, this demo, so that we have time to questions. One, you can use our matching service, and that's the most advanced way of using breastcancertrials.org. What we allow you to do is create a health summary, and we collect, it's a fairly detailed health summary, so we can really provide you with personalized matching. This is an example of a health summary for a patient with metastatic disease who's really had been heavily pre-treated. It's a patient who's HER2 positive, but estrogen negative. And, oops, looks like I logged out. Wait a minute, let me just log back in. I timed out. Okay. So the patient has now an opportunity. These are the trials that are available to that patient. The patient can jump to various types of trials, whether it's chemotherapy or targeted therapy or vaccines and immunotherapy. And there are certain features that I just want to point out that go across all of our resources. One, not only do we want to help patients find trials, but we want to make it easy for patients to talk about trials with their physicians. So we rewrite all of our summaries in patient-friendly language. We provide a headline text to give you a very quick overview of what this trial is for, as opposed to the official NCI title. So we create a summary that gives you the rationale, a little bit of background, and what the trial's about. We give you the opportunity in this trial of saving those trials for favorites. So if you want to come back, you can look at them. We also provide information about what's involved at a very high level. We're not trying to make patients be experts on trials. I mean, that's really the role of a research investigator or your physician. We want to give you enough information so you feel comfortable talking to your doctor. For every trial, we also provide some additional information. We provide the link to cancer.gov or clinicaltrials.gov and background information that we find about the particular therapies. Oops. And we make it easy for you to find the contact information as well on the trial. So that's our matching service. And one other thing about the matching service is people who create a profile and save it to BCT have the opportunity really of being able to participate in our trial alert service. And what that means is you've created this profile. We're always adding trials. We have 660 trials. We add about 5 to 10 trials a week. We will match you always on the back end so that you can determine, we let you know by email through our trial alert service if there's a new trial that might be of interest to you. And in doing so, it's ways that you can keep track with current research. We have about over 5,000 people that participate in our trial alert service, and many of them come back. But if you don't want to create a profile, then we have other ways that you can participate in research. And what we have is our browse. You can browse our listings. And with our browse trials listing, I said there's 651. And if you want to scroll down those, you can do that. But what we have is different ways that you can do that. So, for example, if you want to heard about Perjeta and you want to take a look at, Perjeta trials, you can do a search on Perjeta, and we'll pull out trials that are studying Perjeta, which is a new drug by Genentech. We also, one thing we do is we enable you to hook up two terms. And you can hook up those two terms in the search box by an or and an and. And this can be very, very frustrating. People do search boxes and they automatically hook up with an or connector, and the search results are not what you want. I spelled something wrong, I think. Wait a minute. Okay, so again, if you're looking for trials specifically for patients with HER2-positive breast cancer, you could clearly just put those two search terms. If you wanted to find HER2-positive in brain, you could hook up those search terms. So we have a variety of ways that you can search. Last thing, we have lots of filters, different ways that you can look for trials. You can look for trials for complementary and alternative medicine. You could look for trials for a very popular search, vaccines and immunotherapy. So just take a look at all of the various filters that we have that will enable you to more easily look for. One thing we've been focusing on is, can we make it easy for people to search for trials based upon their disease? Again, if they don't want to do a large profile, and let's say you have inflammatory breast cancer, and we allow you to search for trials based upon your biomarker status, and we have configured it so that we're only showing you trials that are available for patients with inflammatory breast cancer. We are also very interested in helping metastatic patients, and as Christine said, we recently launched something called Metastatic Trial Search, and I'm really happy to say we'll be bringing Metastatic Trial Search to Share. Sometime we've funded to expand to different sites. We've initially worked with 5 different sites, and what's nice about Metastatic Trial Search is that it's embedded on the sites of the organizations that we are participating with. You just put a small amount of information about your breast cancer, and then we will then bring you information about trials that from breastcancertrials.org, again, all delivered to the site. We are in the process of, we learned a lot from patients about what they liked and what they didn't like about Metastatic Trial Search to this pilot phase, and we are going to be working to improve it by adding more filters. Some of the features that you saw on breastcancertrials.org will be bringing to Metastatic Breast Trial Search, a way of looking at newly added trials, a way of adding more filters so that we can reduce the number of trials that come to the desktop from 99 to a much more reasonable number. So let me just quickly go back to the rest of our presentation, so I leave time for questions. I'm going too fast.
Take your time, Elly. There are no questions yet.
Okay. All right. So I'm very proud of the work we've done with breastcancertrials.org and really trying to help patients sort through clinical trial information in a more patient-friendly way. But there are other clinical options for looking at clinical trials, and we link to them. So the granddaddy of all is clinicaltrials.gov, and this is produced and maintained by the National Library of Medicine. By law, every clinical trial that's taking place in America has to be registered in clinicaltrials.gov. And so it is the main resource. It's not particularly patient-friendly, but it has a lot of information. And you may feel very comfortable using clinicaltrials.gov, and I certainly encourage you to do that. But it's also a way of looking at more information about a trial that you've learned at breastcancertrials.org. Once you've become familiar with it, you can search on a specific trial and then see the additional information. Another resource is the Cancer Registry that's made available by the National Cancer Institute. They add more information about clinical trials. It's more patient-friendly than clinicaltrials.gov. You just have to be aware that they're only listing NCI-affiliated trials. And there's a fairly broad definition of what that means. Any trial that's taking place at a site that receives NCI funding, so any comprehensive NCI comprehensive cancer site or any NCI cancer center, regardless of who is sponsoring that trial will appear in cancer.gov, which is the website organized by the National Cancer Institute. But if there's a trial that's only taking place at physician offices or trials that are taking place at community cancer centers, it might not be cancer.gov, and so it's important to know that distinction. Another resource, I don't have it listed here, but it's a really good one, is the Army of Women. And the Army of Women is very easy to register for. It's run by the Dr. Susan Love Research Foundation. All you put in is your sort of name, rank, serial number, and serial number meaning your email address. And they will alert you to studies that are available. So they're not looking at any real personal characteristics. They're not triaging that to you. They make all studies available. And they tend to be more epidemiological studies where they're looking for large populations very, very quickly. But again, it's a really good resource from a very reputable organization. So lastly, my parting message to you is we're a community, and clinical trials are important to us, but it's important to everybody in our community who has breast cancer. It's important to people who have not developed breast cancer. I have 2 daughters, and they've seen their grandmother and their mother affected by breast cancer, and we don't have a known genetic mutation. I don't want my daughters, I want, if they develop breast cancer, I want them to know that there is the most effective way of treating their cancer, potentially curing it in a way that's going to minimize toxicity and side effects. So we as a community are all responsible for making sure that we're not all doing the same thing. We really have to work together. So I see trials as a partnership between patients and providers and research investigators. Right now, most patients who participate in trials learn about it from their providers. But we as patients can be proactive. If your provider is not talking to you about a trial, then you can use the resources that are available to inform your providers about trials. And all I'm suggesting is that we really always be a discussion about trials as an option for care. And if that discussion is not made available, you might want to think about getting a second opinion. On the flip side, nobody should unduly force you to participate in a trial by any kind of heavy-handed recruitment. The decision is always up to you, but being informed is the best way of making a good decision. So I thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Elly. So a couple of questions. How often are trials updated on BCT or MTS?
So we update trials. The same group of trials that are delivered to MTS come from BCT, from our repository. We add 5 to 10 trials a week on BCT. There is a little bit, just to be totally transparent, there could be a slight delay as to when a trial appears in clinicaltrials.gov and when it's on BCT. And that's because we have to go through a process of looking at that trial. We write our own summaries, and to make those as accurate as possible, we go through a process with a medical editor who's been editing our trials since 2008. And so there's a bit of a delay between a trial first appears on clinicaltrials.gov and when it appears on BCT. We are also, one thing is, we take very seriously our ability to translate things into patient-friendly language. And we have a research project now with funding from Komen Foundation to really look at the information, how we present information, how we describe clinical trials, and to create a glossary of more patient-friendly terms so we can be more consistent in terms that we use to describe trials. And we'll be doing interviews to make sure that that glossary is really, really effective.
That's great. So another question, do research institutions post all of their trials to these clinical trial websites?
So that's a really, really great question. By law, they have to post phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And I always forget whether or not they post phase 1 trials. For the most part, they do, because in addition to there being a federal requirement, the journal editors have a requirement now. And this started maybe about 2008, and that really changed everything. And the journal editors say that if you don't post your clinical trials in a government registry within a certain amount of time, they are not going to publish any papers that come from that research. And so I would say research in terms of clinical trials, that the research institutions are very good at posting their clinical trials in clinicaltrials.gov. And that's the source of information that we use. Now, observational studies is a different thing. That may not be complete because they're not required by law, and there's no mandate from the journal editors that observational studies, and by that observational studies, I mean things like the Metastatic Breast Cancer Project that's being hosted at Harvard. That is not yet in clinicaltrials.gov, and we are trying to get them to post it in clinicaltrials.gov because our quality control is we don't post things unless they're in clinicaltrials.gov. So those kinds of studies may not be in clinicaltrials.gov. The other things that may sort of miss in clinicaltrials.gov is certain kinds of complementary and alternative medicine types of trials where there are interventions. But treatment trials, I would say, are almost all in clinicaltrials.gov.
Okay, great. And I know that we're a little bit over, but Joanne has another excellent question here. In phase 3 trials, what's the definition of standard of care for the placebo group?
So the standard of care is what is most commonly used for that patient population. And one example is, and sometimes they leave it up to the investigator. So for a heavily pretreated population, there was a trial last year. It was called the Beacon trial. And the Beacon trial was looking at a new drug for treating very, very advanced metastatic breast cancer in patients who have been very heavily pretreated. And in that population, there really isn't a standard of care or guidelines that really say what should be a drug that's used. So it's often up to the physician's discretion. And in that trial, that's exactly what they said, that the standard of care was going to be at the physician discretion. And I'm assuming in this, just to be transparent, I think that question is great. For let's say metastatic trials that are, let's say for patients who have had some pretreatment, whether the standard of care follows a specific set of guidelines for patients who have progressed, let's say on first-line therapy, I'm not sure as to whether there is a specific standard of care at every process, or there are things that could be chosen and the investigator chooses it. But it's definitely an accepted regimen of treatment, but whether there's a standard of care for patients who have progressed on one treatment for metastatic breast cancer, I don't know. Great question.
Yes. And I think that there was another question, but I think that you answered it on metastatic trial search. Can you search by metastatic site? And it was clear that you can.
By site, by you're talking about institution?
No, by the site of the metastasis.
Oh,
so
yeah.
bone
Yes.
mets, or brain mets, for example. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, that was actually really important when we thought of that, and we thought about, again, this is a pilot, so what was the minimum data set that we could collect? We wanted to find a balance between a patient entering just a small amount of data and the trial results that they would get. Mm-hmm. And we worked with our collaborators, and we felt where patients had their disease was very important. Patients who have only metastases to their bones and no other site are often frustrated because they'll see trials for metastatic breast cancer and then they'll call up and find out that they're not eligible. Right. And same thing for patients who have metastasis to the brain. Not all trials, many trials are looking at drugs that don't cross the blood-brain barrier. And if you just simply look at the title, you wouldn't know about it. So we really wanted to manage people's expectations.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much, Elly. That was an excellent program. I hope everyone got some information they can use. Please take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. We always like to see what we're doing, what we could do better. And we're always looking for ideas for other programs. So, Elly, thank you once again. Really, really great presentation. Appreciate everything that you do.
Yeah, and I just put up my email address in our Facebook page, and people are just welcome. If they have questions, they're welcome to email me.
Excellent. All right.
Thank
you
you
so much, Elly.
You're welcome.
Bye, everyone.